Welcome to the very first episode of The Builder's Bench. I'm Craig Larkins, and this is where politics meets construction. The writ has dropped, and the federal election is officially underway. Canadians will cast their vote on April 28th. With 1.6 million Canadians employed in our industry, construction holds massive political power if we make our voices heard. That is why we're here today with The Builder's Bench, which of course is inspired by the front bench in Parliament. Let's get to it by introducing your Builder's Bench panelists. Joining me today, we have Rod Gilbert, President of the Canadian Construction Association. Hello, Rod. We have Louis-Philippe Champagne, Associate Vice President, Public Affairs and Industry Practices, also with the CCA, and Sajjid Lakhani, Director, Government Relations and Strategy at Impact Public Affairs. Quick note as well, Chris Atchison, the President of the BC Construction Association, will be joining us in the future as a permanent panelist as well. So thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
We are hot on the heels of the election being called. We are one day after. So I wanted to start today's episode with an update on the latest polls, given we have seen quite a shift in the numbers over the past couple weeks with leadership changes and such. So LP, can you break down the latest numbers for us?
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting time to have a federal election. We've been spending the last 2 years speculating about how long the Trudeau government would survive, whether a vote of no confidence would take place, and where we're going with this. Finally, we get there. Spring 2025, with only a few months left to live to that government anyway, making it a really lengthy minority government. But I think there's a few things to look into here. First and foremost, Mark Carney was elected leader or nominated leader of the Liberal last Sunday. And, if you ask my opinion, I think his preference would have been to launch the election right away. Be on stage, say, I won. I'm not going to be an unelected prime minister. Let's go into an election. There's a few things that made it impossible. I think the Liberal were not quite ready for an election yet. And arguably all party were not quite ready. So they needed some time to vet candidates and get them announced and all of this. But also because of the duration of the campaign, which I think is really the key takeaway of what happened at Rideau Hall yesterday. We're now into day one of a 36-day election campaign. This is the shortest possible campaign by law in electoral law. And I think this is a good strategic decision for Carney and the Liberals because they are heading into an election with very high number in the poll and with a leader that never ran for office anywhere. So being on the bus, being on the plane for 50 some days would be a real challenge. Keeping it short is probably in their best advantage there. Launching last Sunday would have led us to have E-Day on Easter Monday, which wouldn't work. So I think that's probably why they waited a week, tried to make the best out of it with some trip in Europe, and that's where we are now. Now, talking of number, you did bring it up. The Liberal in the past month have been recovering tremendously of the last few years in very tough spot. The Poilievre administration have been riding the poll very high for a year and a half since Poilievre came around as leader. And now what we see is the moment Justin Trudeau resigned, that started to shift, even before we had a new Liberal leader. So really what we can see here is that the usage of power really was difficult for the Liberals. And just having a vacant seat there in the Prime Minister's office was really helpful for their brand. We've seen them recover to a point where, most pollsters would say they're tied right now. Some would say they're slightly ahead of the Conservative. But what really matters, in my opinion, is when you look at seat projection. It's an imperfect science. You don't know for sure how things will shape up. And Sajjid probably have a lot of interesting info there at the regional level. But fundamentally, a tied Conservative-Liberal dynamic means more seat for the Liberal, means potentially Liberal majority government, which is words that I would have never expected to say just a few weeks ago.
And what about the NDP? We've seen a drop in the polls for them and such. So can you touch on where we're sitting with them?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, the NDP is in a precarious spot right now. The last few weeks have been difficult in terms of public support. And I think it comes down to where party sees themselves and what Canadians are looking for. What polling numbers shows us right now is that people want a new leader for Canada. They're concerned with what's happening in the US. They see political pressure. They want to say, hey, we need the best person in that office to make sure we protect our sovereignty, our dignity, and what we are as a country. And this is really a campaign, a very decisive campaign, in my opinion, that will matter this time, that will define who's that right person. And when you ask most Canadians, right now the majority seems to think Mark Carney is the right person, but a lot think that it's Pierre Poilievre. Not that many think that Jack Meeting should be the next prime minister, let alone a strong voice in parliament. So their national number have been down. Doesn't mean that they're irrelevant. In many regions of the country, they will certainly hold many seats, but their performance, especially in BC and Quebec, I think will have significant impact on how much seat the Liberal can really salvage there and potentially put behind their belt for a majority.
Thanks, LP. Sajjid, we've seen a jump in seats. What is your take on the current situation? I remember speaking to you the last time we were in this sort of shotgun election was with Kim Campbell, and I'll remember the story with that. What's your take on where we're at right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo LP's sentiments in terms of the runoff period. Mr. Carney needed those 9 days to build a foundation going into the election and signal to Canadians that the Trudeau era is over. From canceling the consumer carbon tax to canceling the capital gains tax, Mr. Carney's team needed to build this foundation so at the doors they could convince Canadians that it's a new era and new leadership. And in terms of the NDP, agree with LP. It's very difficult for a leader who hasn't really gained much momentum over 2 elections to go into this one and argue that he's the best leader to stand up to the president. And in terms of the Canadian issues now, it is not like previous elections. Social issues are not at the top of the ballot. It's relations with the president and the Americans, jobs, healthcare, inflation, housing, which is very relevant to our industry. So it's quite a historic election with only a 37-day runoff period. It's short, and it's going to mean a lot of touch points, and it's going to mean that campaigns are going to have to be on it to ensure that they can connect with the most people and ID as many voters. In terms of the seats, yeah, Craig, there's been an increase in seats, and 295 of the federal ridings have been redrawn with new boundaries. Many of those urban centers, which may not help the Liberals or the NDP, but perhaps the Conservatives can prioritize on their branding of the working class. We saw the Boots Not Suits campaign, among others, that Mr. Poilievre is introducing. So definitely going to be a learning experience for constituents who may not know where their riding is or who their candidates are, and as well as for candidates who will have to campaign in areas that traditionally they did not have in their ridings, maybe a very different demographic. For example, Peter Julien has to start campaigning in Maillardville, a strong French-Canadian community in Coquitlam, and historically never had that. So it's going to be a challenge for a lot of candidates to reach these new voters and convince them that they're in their best interest.
And for voters listening, I would say that's your first step is to take a moment to research. Maybe you are in those new lines that are drawn for your constituency. I always say to my friends, as much time as you spend scrolling on Netflix, you should take some time to research your area and who you should be voting for. Rod, you've been at the forefront
Absolutely.
of the advocacy efforts for CCCA. Did you want to weigh in on the current political climate, your thoughts?
So I think when you look at the polling and what LP explained, funny enough, and if you I spent the day today looking at social media about the campaign, and it seems that both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre both promises tax break for middle class Canadian, and that's exactly what we were expecting to play in that demographic where voting people might look for. And funny enough, the NDP promised new housing, but not really explaining how they would pay for it and what the real impact would be. And that's funny, they made that announcement in Montreal where their chance of gaining any kind of seats is kind of low, if you ask me. And the other thing that came up a little bit today during the campaign is that we feel that both the provincial NDP government, both in BC and Manitoba, I'm not sure how supportive of the actual NDP they are, because they're both looking for a leader that's going to face President Trump. So I think the next few weeks will be extremely interesting.
I was going to ask you, Sajjid, as well. So Prime Minister Carney is from the West, I believe in Edmonton, an area in Alberta. Not typically we have a Liberal leader from the West or Prime Minister. I think the last one would have been Stephen Harper. So do you think that would have any influence on the Western vote, on flipping some of those red to blue or other way around?
Maybe Oilers fans, because I know he was very well embraced by the Edmonton Oilers organizations, including Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. But that has an impact. Although, the Liberals aren't polling as well in provinces like Alberta, so it will be a challenge. If you look at this cabinet going into the election, there's not much Western representation either. It really goes back to the Liberal Party's roots of Ile-de-Montréal and GTA representation. Mind you, that those are the areas that the Liberal Party has historically done best. So perhaps the approach is let's gain back our areas that we lost under the Trudeau era, as we know, those by-elections in Toronto and Montreal, and then move westwards. In British Columbia, arguably the most politically diverse province, with the Greens, the NDP, the Liberals, and Conservatives being well represented. So it's going to be important to ensure that all parties can either gain momentum or keep their momentum going there.
Yeah, and we'll dive into...
I think maybe, Craig, if I can...
Yeah, for sure.
If it's just I can add to that, I think not if about Mark Carney being from West, but I think right now, if from the start of the campaign, it's the candidate that the Liberals are attracting right now. Amarjeet Sohi, Mayor of Edmonton, just said that he would run for the Liberal again. I think the former Mayor of Vancouver is running for the Liberal.
Yep.
I've been hearing rumors in BC also that Christy Clark is almost done. I think she's going to be part of the Liberal slate too. So I think all this locally could have a real impact. Like mostly when you think that the seats are changing and the riding are changing, I think that's a powerful message that you're sending there.
Absolutely. I just want to add onto that, Rod, as well. Sorry, that
Nope.
Unfortunately, Christy Clark does not have a riding yet. The riding that she was speculated to run in Fleetwood, Port Kells, Surrey, just went to another candidate, Gurp Svensai. So it'll be interesting to note if there is room for her. But I agree that Mr. Carney's team and Mr. Poilievre's teams are attracting interesting candidates. A lot of young candidates are running for the Conservatives, while a lot of quote-unquote star candidates with political experience are running in BC and Alberta.
I was going to save this segment for a little later, but since we're in it, let's go for it. Who to watch? LP, do you want to weigh in on this? Are there any big names in politics that could shake up the race? I mean, we just mentioned former mayor of Vancouver has thrown his hat into the ring for the Liberals. So who's on your mind?
Yeah, there's some big name out there. That's for sure. I think, what we need to realize is it's been a long time since people were rushing the door of the Liberal Party to become candidates. Like there's been a few tough elections for Liberals, even though they've been winning. It wasn't the case all the time. That says, I will point out that there's a number of riding that didn't have Liberal candidate until very recently, still being appointed right now. And it's not necessarily the biggest gun that they could find. It's just they're trying to fill the ballot to make sure they have people everywhere. So while there is some star candidate, like we've seen announced again today, there's definitely some massive gaps in quality of candidate. And maybe if I can just pivot a bit here, and I'm sure other will have perspective on big names, but I think at the strategic level, what's going to really define the victory here is a matter of ghost. I think the two leaders have significant ghosts they need to get rid of. On one side, you have Pierre Poilievre, who's going to have to do everything he can to be sure to differentiate himself from Donald Trump. He is, again, seen by a lot of Canadians as mini Donald, and this is difficult for him to be in that position. He for years told us we need to have an election on axe the tax or an affordability crisis. And now his number one job is to make sure people realize that he's not Donald Trump and that he can be the guy standing up to him and defending Canadian value. Meanwhile, Mark Carney has his ghost of his own. He needs to be seen as not Justin Trudeau 2.0. He was in his prime minister office. He was a senior advisor to him. Most of his cabinet and many candidates are Trudeau's candidates. And right now, it is not a winning point for Carney to be seen as Trudeau's guy. So both of them will be trying to chase that branding and redefine themselves. In just 36 days, it's going to be rough to do.
That's a tight timeline.
Just to add to that, Greg, just quickly, even everyone around Mark Carney right now, everyone around him was with Justin Trudeau before. And it's not public. They're not in the forefront of it, but everyone knows about it. So I agree with LP. That's going to be a major challenge for him.
Sajjid?
Agree with my two colleagues here. It's going to be challenging for the Liberals to convince Canadians at the doors that they're not rewarding bad behavior by voting for them. It is still the same party as my colleagues mentioned here. Still a lot of the same candidates, still a lot of the same team. And they're going to have to really convince Canadians or British Columbians that like in business, the buck stops with the CEO, the buck stops with the president. In this case, the buck stops with the leader, and the leader is going to really shake things up in a direction that a lot of disenfranchised Liberals from the Trudeau era didn't agree with and may agree with now. You're thinking your old Chrétien, Paul Martin Liberals who may be brought back into the fold due to Mr. Carney's leadership.
It's interesting, too, because in public perception, once the sticker gets stuck on your back, it's hard to get that off in the eyes of the public. So that I would have to agree with you on kind of moving forward and shaking the previous brand, as I like to say. All right, switching gears. Are we okay with that?
Yep.
Next segment, it's called the Top 5, our industry's biggest election priorities. Before we dive into campaign specifics, which we kind of already have, I wanted to set the stage. If Canada's construction sector had a wish list for this election, which I'm sure we do have a very long one, what would be the top 5 asks? And we'll start with you, Rod.
I think it's. First of all, we need but all the parties needs to commit to like growing the economy, because by growing the economy, that would give the opportunity to increase the infrastructure investment. I think when you think about the housing affordability, housing crisis that we're facing, it's true that's an issue we should be facing. But the real issue right now, it's do we have the housing infrastructure that we need to build all these houses? And that's been the problem for years. We've been advocating for that with the federal government for years. And I'm really hoping that all the party will be committing to that. And so far, we've not seen it. It's only day one. But I think it's going to come. From our discussion that we had with both parties, LP and I think it's a matter of time. I think that it's just a question of timing. But I think for me, infrastructure investment is the key for that campaign.
LP.
Yeah, I think you got a right point there with infrastructure. And we have some, very good indicator already of where this is going. Mark Carney's leadership campaign platform is still available on his website. And you can look in there, and there's significant language around infrastructure investment. His campaign slogan was to build Canada, right? It was almost like they took language from the CCA website to some extent on trade infrastructure and housing infrastructure. Now we just need to see this, making it in the party platform and becoming the key topic at the debate and ending up being part of the ballot question. And I think for our industry, it's been a difficult time. We were just in Quebec City 2 weeks ago at our conference, and we hear from contractors across the country about the pressure they're feeling from the workforce crisis, from the economic dynamic with the U.S., and what they want to see is the capacity to build stuff. That's all we want at the end of the day, right? And when the governments, especially the federal government, is putting the pressure of his wallet toward trade infrastructure, toward housing infrastructure, we can really start having significant difference in Canada. We just need to see this happening in the political platform. And I think it's going to be a big point of the campaign. Same for the Conservative. Just the announcement we had a few days ago about shovel-ready project and the desire to cut red tape and get things going faster. There is an interest to see things moving. I believe most political actors recognize the need for now investing more than ever. Now, the balance of that is, of course, when you're in an election, you'll see a number of populistic measures taking the forefront, right? Cutting the tax will be a big part of the question. And, of course, cutting the tax is important so that Canadian can make ends meet. But if you cut the tax, it's hard to reinvest at the same time. So it's all about fiscal balance.
Sajjid, thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree with Ron. LP. Infrastructure development is probably the biggest priority. Making an accessible market with less red tape for building in terms of capital projects, commercial infrastructure, housing, you name it. We just need to keep up with the services that we need for Canadians.
I wanted to briefly touch on Trump and the tariffs, because when we were in Quebec City, Chantal Hebert gave an amazing talk about just the current state and her experience with elections. And she said, this election is going to be all about Trump, and that might overshadow the other issues. Do you think, is that a concern that we're not going to be able to talk about housing and infrastructure and such, or is it just going to be too loud with Trump?
I think the main point is, how Pierre Poilievre has been campaigning for some time on the affordability crisis and the need to make life more affordable for Canadians. This is going to be a difficult argument to bring back in the campaign. I think that's where the Conservative will have to pivot toward that, facing Trump rather than just cutting the tax and all of that. But the fact remains that Trump itself is a disruptor to Canadian. Right? It's not a simple policy that you can easily patch. It's not about changing our approach to the U.S. and then it magically goes away. The question is, how do we tackle the U.S. dynamic? So far, the government have looked at economic measure to fight back and engage them in that trade war, which is counter-tariff and export bans and different measure of that type. But at the end of the day, we'll need to take some domestic public policy position to make sure we are able to face the U.S. and deal with the uncertainty that we see there, but also protecting ourselves by diversifying our trade. And how does that take place? Well, again, trade-enabling infrastructure investment is one of the most important things. If we can get our goods to the coast and then get it to Asia and Europe, this really changed our dynamic toward the US, as well as buying Canadian. If you can move things within Canada and lower trade barrier between provinces, you really have success there. So I guess what I'm saying to your question is, in order to get to facing Trump, you need to make those decisions domestically that will be positive for construction. So for me, it's two the same thing.
Rod,
So
did you?
I would say, yeah, just I think President Trump gave us an opportunity to discuss amongst ourselves about all this, like trade barrier, interprovincial trade barrier, fixing your industry, investing in infrastructure, the cost of living, all of this are a discussion that we should have had like years ago. Now today, I think President Trump gave us the opportunity to tackle it. Like I remember, like I was in Toronto, like when Justin Trudeau was still the prime minister, and I think I explained that before. Like when you're all public and you say, okay, let's fix the internal trade barrier, that everyone agreed we should do it. But when we're closed door and every provincean understand what that means for everyone, oh, the situation is different. We're not sure we want to do it. There's an impact to that. So I think, you know what? I can't believe I'm going to say that, but I think the fact that President Trump is creating that commercial trade wars, I think it's a great opportunity for us. And it's also a great opportunity for our industry to show how we can be part of the solution.
It also has
It's easy to
ignited a
be
fire.
pessimistic.
So go ahead.
Sorry, it's really easy to be pessimistic in these times, right? Because we've been faced with the labor shortage, and we've been faced with the COVID pandemic and the economic recovery, and we're now faced with the U.S. situation. But I think what's important to keep in mind is, just in my time in the industry, I've been with CCA for 5 years now. When I started, politicians and even the general public didn't care all that much about construction. It was very much an industry taken for granted. We've been building for hundreds of years, we'll keep building no matter what, right? And if you look at the last 2 years, suddenly people wake up. They say, hey, housing is a real problem. We need to pay attention to that. The workforce shortage is a real problem. We need to pay attention to that. The trade infrastructure, right? At CCA, we've had a campaign running for 2 years called CTIP, the Canadian Trade Infrastructure Plan. We've been doing that with a lot of partners in Western Canada and across the country, saying we need to reinvest in trade infrastructure because Canada is seen internationally as a trade partner, as a great exporter of natural resource and manufactured good. But in the last ranking from the World Bank, we fell from that top 10 position where we used to be to number 32nd, right after Azerbaijan. There's really a shift that's happening that Canada can no longer play its role of trade partner. And that campaign hasn't picked up a lot of interest in the first few months of it. The provincial government stepped in and said, hey, we love this. All premier co-signed a press statement saying, yeah, we like CTIP. We want to have federal leadership there, but nothing out of Ottawa. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump happened. Again, with opportunity, with risk come opportunities, and we now see a pivot toward interest into that language.
I know I was going to say earlier is, it's also ignited a fire on the voter base as far as that Canadiana theme, and there's that fear of what's happening, and that's why we're here to kind of break down as well how it will impact industry. Sajjid, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. The construction industry is at the forefront of this election with President Trump's tariffs from steel and aluminum to implementing them most likely in April across the board. There's a lot of opportunity for industry to be a part of the conversation and part of the debate. And from Confederation to now, it just takes American threats for Canadians to band together. And regardless of who wins the election, we have a shot over the next 4 years to carve out our own identity in a commercial and business manner and diversify our trade routes, because we know we cannot rely on them anymore. And perhaps while it's a threat, it's also an opportunity, as Rod pointed out.
Thank you. All right, let's dive into some election news breakdowns, announcements, and such. There were some late last week, from the Conservatives related to construction. We mentioned it earlier, being Mr. Poilievre's announcement for more boots, less suits. I believe he made that announcement on Friday, planning to train 350,000 more trades workers across the country, creating more training halls, direct grants, and faster EI to apprentices. So, thoughts on this announcement, Rod?
Well, it's all good news. I think anything that could bring more people into the industry, I mean, we're takers. My question would be like, where are they going to find them? That was always the issue with the construction industry. Like we had a campaign running for years called Talents Fits Here, and really the idea was to try to attract people into the industry, and it's not that easy. And I think it's a bigger discussion. And I think like in BC, you have a massive workforce issue. And as we've worked through that for a few months about like maybe immigration is the solution, we need to attract like the right people to Canada to work into these jobs. So it is a good news, and we're expecting every parties to do something about it because workforce issue will not go away. And if we want to fulfill all these commitments about building more houses, more infrastructure, we need the people. So I think it was a good news. I think more to come.
So I want to throw in the shovel-ready zones as well. That announcement was made earlier in the week as well. LP, do you want to weigh in on both announcements? Thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Let me first talk about workforce because it's been a top priority for CCA for 2 years, and we've recently been talking more about the housing infrastructure need and recent announcement. But you'll remember that our Hill Day in 2023 was dedicated to the workforce issue, and it's still very much present in construction. It's easy to forget. Canada went through a serious workforce shortage industry-wide, not just construction, but all industry, especially in the service industry and construction, have been suffering quite badly in 2022, 2023. This has been recovering, right? There's some positive there. If you look at the whole economy, we've recovered that vacancy rate pretty nicely. The big problem that we're having is that construction remain the number one industry with the highest vacancy rate. It's the hardest industry to bring people in because of the challenges in certification and training that you need to get in order to join the industry. You can't just be, during COVID, government will tell us, well, people are not working in restaurants are closed, why don't they just join you and become plumber? Well, it's not as simple as that. It takes some time and training and work, right? And this is the issue we're facing right now, where that remaining gap, there's still plenty of vacancies in construction that need to be filled. The question is, where do we get these workers? Now, there are Canadian citizens that want to work in construction and just need to find that job where they're best fitted, right? But the reality is that jobs are regional in nature. If you build a mine in Northern Ontario, you can't move it downtown Toronto. The mine is up north. You need to get the workforce there. And quite often that makes it very challenging. This is why you have that kind of disruptancies. Hopefully, on the long term, we manage as an industry with the help of government to convince Canadians of how good these jobs are. The reality is that working in construction is a great career. Those are well-paying jobs. It's stable. It's a good, environment to work in. More and more, we've been transforming ourselves as an industry to make it more inclusive and safer. But the reality is that it's going to take generation to change this, right? It's going to take the new generation of school that are currently in high school to graduate and make it to the job site. In the meantime, we need to fill that gap. Otherwise, project just won't happen in time. And the only solution is immigration. And that's a big word that nobody want to talk about. Both parties are, looking back at the number from 2023 and saying we had way too many people coming to Canada, which is where CCA is really clear that it's not a matter of more or less immigration. It's about the right immigration. There always will be a need immigration to have refugee and proper social immigration. But when you go into economic immigration, you need to make sure that the people you bring in match the need of the economy. And that's where we have a massive disconnect in Canada. We don't really understand what we need and what job we want to fill. And until we can really fix this and have an honest discussion about workforce, we'll be in that difficult situation where job sites are still not full. On your shovel-ready project, I think it's an interesting proposal from the Conservative campaign. The essence of the announcement is good. We need to reduce red tape, right? Permitting in Canada is one of the worst countries in the world. It takes hundreds of days to get permits on average, whether it is for a home or for a large infrastructure project. A lot of that procurement delays, if I can call it this way, is necessary to make sure that procurement is done accurately and that we have the benefits out of the project that we want. But a lot of it is unnecessary, right? Around security clearance that is not done effectively or properly, around quotas that not always meet the goal of the public policy they are in place for. So trying to find these pre-approved direction is probably for the best of everyone. And we've seen it in BC as well. Just a few weeks ago, BC have announced that you want to streamline some infrastructure project to face the challenge in the US with trade infrastructure. This is what we need. We need to get going and stop talking about project and just build stuff.
100% agree. And, we have a lot of conversations with the municipalities and local GMs and mayors and such. And in Vancouver alone, I mean, when it comes to permitting, they're embracing the world of digital technology and AI. So it's nice to even just have that conversation started on the federal level as well. Sajjid, my next question, because, you know, a lot of the time, and we're very aware of that, these are just promises being made during an election, and to hold your elected officials' feet to the fire when it comes to these promises. Just in BC alone, there was the promise for trades investment by the provincial government. So did you want to weigh in on the the promises versus policy?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the federal election, it's going to be important for newly elected or re-elected MPs to know how to work with the provincial government here. From the provincial government mandating transit-oriented design, building projects, so maximizing the density, from bringing more folks into the trades. It's going to be important for MPs, specifically ones whose ridings are along SkyTrain routes, to understand that development, construction, based on transit-oriented design and working with the municipalities and provinces is going to be one of their most important jobs in serving their constituents. We know we have a supply shortage here in the Lower Mainland and British Columbia at large, so it's going to be important areas like Port Moody, Surrey, downtown Vancouver, for those MPs to know that they're going to have to work with the provinces and manage intergovernment relations to ensure that they can deliver for their constituents.
Thank you. We'll stick with you for the next question, Sajjid. We're on day one. We're recording today's episode on the official first day of the election. It's definitely going to be a busy week, hopefully. What's the one thing you're watching closely in the early days, Sajjid?
Who can ID the most voters? I want to see online where the polls are standing, but where these voter IDs are. I'm curious how well these new candidates, MPs going for re-election, can identify their new areas. Like I said before, these boundaries are quite significantly altered, and they're going to have to showcase to these new community members that they're in their best interest. So I'm curious to see how that unfolds in the early days here on the ground, and if they're able to build their brand in that sense.
I think what I'm going to be looking for is how Mark Carney is going to react. Like, he's never been elected anywhere, like facing a journalist every day, 2-3 times a day sometimes. I think that would be interesting. And the other part for Pierre Poilievre would be, can he be a prime minister? He was in the opposition for a long time. He was very efficient at it too. Now he needs to switch gear, and maybe now he needs to show Canadian that he's not going to face Justin Trudeau anymore, because Justin Trudeau is not there anymore. Now he's facing Mark Carney, but also can he be the man to be facing President Trump? I think I'll be looking for that in the next few days.
LP, your thoughts?
I like what Rod just said. Being in opposition is very different than being in power. Now, Pierre Poilievre has experience in power. He used to be minister himself. He was in the front bench. He knows how that is. But being in a position is really where he shines. He's a bit of a bulldog in the House of Commons, and people love him for that. But there's a big difference between the guy that stand up and yell and complain and the one who needs to be the face and leading the government. One thing I'll look for is how their decision to not have media on the bus turns out, because this is a significant shift in political coverage, right? Having national journalists with you along the way brings you a lot of visibility. They claim that they do that in order to have more local coverage, but I'm not sure how that's going to turn out for them, especially for Quebec. The French barrier is a big one, and if you want to secure a seat in Quebec, you need to have French journalists covering it. If you're in BC and Alberta, that's just not happening, right? So that should be interesting.
And funny enough, if I can add to that, LP, that's a good point. Like, Mark Carney just turned down a French debate in TVA. They just announced that today. Mm-hmm. That's surprising for me, when that's a place where you need to gain seats. So maybe they're worried about this French. I don't know. So that's quite interesting. Yeah. Good start of the campaign.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing in terms of national level. As I was speaking to a local level earlier, it'll be interesting to see Mr. Carney's political tact. It's very difficult to teach that veteran political mindset, which his competitors are very good at, from debates to the ground game to, that rallying that you need during a campaign. It's very difficult to teach political tact. It's very difficult to teach that awareness. And, as Rod mentioned, perhaps that's leaking into their preferences on which debates to be a part of.
Craig, if you allow me to just come back to your previous question real quick. You mentioned how it has impact to make sure your politician listen to you. One thing that's interesting on timing here is because the election's on April 28th, right? A very short 36-day, 37-day campaign. it's interesting to look at what comes next, because that first 100 day will be very important regardless of what party wins. Mostly because there's no real incumbent. The incumbent prime minister has been there for 9 days. The Poilievre administration is untested at the very least. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how long the transition take place. It's going to be a couple weeks, 3 weeks maybe. If the Conservative win, they need to appoint a whole lot of new staffer that they'll need to find within industry, within different region of Canada. If the Liberals stay, they have a bit more staff ready to go, but still they have to create a whole new cabinet that I believe will be different from the one we've seen at Rideau Hall a few days ago. Very different purpose for a cabinet. And this will all lead into that federal budget that we need so badly because, again, the House of Commons have been in shambles for quite some time. It's been in recess for a few months, but before that, it was totally ineffective. So actual BIA, Budget Implementation Act from Budget 24, were still in limbo when the House was removed. So there is a real need for a federal budget soon and for this to be voted in the House. So I'm expecting a very interesting month of May, especially second half, and early June until they leave for Saint-Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you, LP. So that's perfect segue, actually. So we're just talking about being able to stand on your 2 feet. You know, there's the media stage, there's the debate stage, but there's also the front door stage. And I think that, you know, I've done my fair share of door knocking for political campaigns, and it's an interesting conversation when you have it directly with the voters. So we're coming up with a segment called the Digital Door Knock, and each week we can talk about a specific topic where, you know, the politicians at your front door, it's your direct contact with whether it be the candidate or the political staffers and team that are working for Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, whichever party comes in knocking on your door. So first question, I guess, what should we be preparing people for? If the candidates come knocking on your door, and I'll start with you, LP, what would you say? What would you tell the voter base to react and have questions prepared for?
I love that question. I'll tell you one thing. You know, construction in Canada employs 1.6 million people. That's a whole lot of Canadians. And we are a powerful voice in that election if we stand up and unite behind key messaging and key important policy for our industry. As a matter of fact, I'll give you a bit of a scoop here. I don't know when people will be watching this, but Thursday of this week, in just 48 hours, we'll be releasing our own election campaign, and we're quite excited to see this happening. When we go together, we need to make sure that across the country, we come with that same message of the need for infrastructure investment, the need for workforce modernization, the need to do better on procurement, and making sure that the government hear us and understand the impact that construction has on Canada. Because at the end of the day, that 1.6 million worker end up creating a significant part of our GDP. So if we want to be able to stand up to Donald Trump, if we want to be able to make sure our economy is doing fine, we need to be united and work together on that front.
Yeah, maybe if I can add to that, I think LP, you got it right. And this is why we will be at CCA, we will be working with our provincial and local construction association, because we want to make sure that everyone, when a politician knocks at their door, they need to be equipped to talk to them. And you know what? Like, infrastructure is not like, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it's not a sexy word. What people want, they want their school, they want their hospital, they want their road, they want their park, they want their ring, they want the arena. That's what they're looking for. But all of this, it's all construction. And we need to make sure that citizens, when people knock at their door, that's what they talk about, what they're passionate about, and they want to make sure that they explain what the needs are.
Sajjid.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I just want to echo Rod's sentiments in that. Political candidates in the past have latched onto the term housing when speaking about construction, but it's also more than that. So it's going to be really important for the associations and of course the industry to be behind united messaging, but also mention that it's more than just housing. It's building these capital projects. It's the next generation of schools, hospitals, you name it. And it's such an overarching industry, an overarching mandate that affects Canadians at every point in their life. You know, as I mentioned, the top 5 issues from U.S. relation, jobs, healthcare, inflation, housing, the construction industry has every part of that. You know, a healthier workforce means better net benefits in the industry and across the board for Canadians, and that's going to be really important in this election.
As we like to say here at the VRCA, it all starts with construction, and that is your hospitals, your schools, infrastructure, and such. So yes, and be confident when they come to your door. You know, we're all humans at the end of the day, and you're just having a conversation. But I will say, it is the one point that I had the best conversations was at the door, whether with be a politician or if I was on the other side of the door. Candid conversations, and that again, we all have a part to play in this election, even as voters. Do your research. Do your research. Figure out your life for the next 8 years, even if you want to go that far and dive into it, but definitely do your research. Any final remarks before we wrap things up here?
I would say Canadians really need to pay attention to what's going to be happening in the next 5 weeks. It's easy to become pleasant with politics and think it doesn't really matter if I go out and vote because whoever's going to be elected won't make a difference. And that might be true. Well, I won't argue on that. But fundamentally, the reality is that this election will matter. Unlike most election where we come in with pretty strong poll and we know where things are going, there's been so much movement in the last few weeks. We have no idea if Mark Carney will be able to sustain these numbers. Maybe he'll burn down in flame. Maybe he'll become the next majority Liberal government. The same could be true for Poilievre. So this is one of the elections that will be the most impactful. And I think as a result, politicians across the country will care about what people say. And, you know, when we talk about construction, it's easy to think in silo and just think, well, we care about infrastructure, but does my parent really care about that? Well, let me tell you, yes, they do. CCA just finished to run a full month of public opinion research to inform our campaign. And what we see is really impressive number of support from the general public saying, you know, at 83%, 8 in 10 Canadians say the rate at which we build home is way too slow. And you know what? They would be right, because if we want to meet the target of the CMHC, we need to more than double our housing start. 72% tells us the rate at which we build hospital is too slow. 60-something% about school. Everything takes so much time, and we need it now. So, you know, I would say to everyone listening, be out there, be involved. That campaign matter, and you matter.
Thanks, LP. Sajjid, final remarks.
Yeah, I just want to echo LP's sentiments and also add, if you're not at the table, you're on the table. So this is such an important election for all Canadians from across every industry, but especially construction to show up and share their voice, because, you know, we're facing probably one of the biggest existential threats we have faced as a country. So it's time to rally together and, get some work done.
Rod, final remarks, please.
Be engaged, be involved. Like, I think that's important. Your vote matter. And you know what? We have that tradition, like bring your kids to work, where you show them like what you do, what you explain. I would say for this campaign, I would say bring a friend to the voting station. Bring a friend to vote, because you know what? Your vote matter.
I love it.
And you can't complain if you vote.
And you know what? Bring a friend to the kitchen table and have maybe a book club style election research party of sorts. Do what you got to do to get in the know. I wanted to point out, you had mentioned the debate. So the leaders debate, I was reading this earlier as well. The federal election campaign will be held in Montreal on April 16th in French and 17th in English. So Prime Minister Carney rather, turned down the French one. Is that correct, Rod? Okay.
No, not that one. So there's always a face-to-face
okay.
with the different station. Yeah. Everyone agreed to it, and it was a funny thing. They had to pay this year or whatever, but Prime Minister Carney declined that one, which is surprising.
Very surprising. And this election, of course, this is episode 1. It's just getting started. So is the Builders Bench. So we will be reaching out to industry leaders from across the country who will be joining us. Our rotating cast of panelists, LP and I will be here permanently. Rod will be jumping in, as will Chris Atchison from BC Construction Association, and even Janine Martin from the VRCA, the president of the VRCA. So follow us, subscribe, listen. We'll be on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, all the good streaming platforms. Your vote builds the future. And just on a fun note, it can't be serious all the time. It's a tradition for me, just like in hockey. I grow an election beard. I've done it for years. So over the duration of the podcast and today, you will be noticing an election beard. A couple of my friends and I do it. So, I mean, that's how you get people involved. That's how you get people involved.
Get them talking.
Get people engaged.
Like
so,
it.
yes, great conversation starter. Thank you all for being here today. Episode 2 will be coming up next week, and we'll have lots to talk about.